Additionally, speaking of the final, the room has been selected. I forget the number, but the syllabus has been updated, or you can just look at the Alberta website. I found it. It's in a very weird location, so I would recommend finding it before the day of the test. Maybe after, just take a little field trip. Go up there. I'm sure you all know about like context-dependent memory. Maybe study there every once in a while, because it is a little weird writing the test in a different location. So make sure you find that. Any questions about the test, paper, or any housekeeping stuff? Okay, so as I say, we're at the halfway point. And to help orient us for what we're going to look at next, I want to remind you all of that distinction between the three main areas of philosophy, one of which was a term on the test. Epistemology, metaphysics, and value theory, which we don't really cover in this course. I will note in the fall, I'm teaching a course on moral psychology, which does overlap to some degree with value theory, but in this course, we're only really looking at these two. So epistemology, as some of you knew, based on the test, is the study of knowledge, so how we know things, what knowledge consists of. And metaphysics is the study of what's real, what exists. The first half of the class, the philosophy of science, was primarily this. Metaphysics comes up a bit in the scientific realism chapter, but it's primarily about, philosophy of science primarily relates to epistemology. The second half of the course, the philosophy of mind section, is primarily about metaphysics, what's real. In particular, we're going to be asking, what is the mind? What kind of thing is the mind, or indeed, is the mind a thing at all? This is the subject matter of psychology. Psychology is the study of the mind, so worth asking what kind of thing is the mind. So we'll start working our way through the book. The book starts off with this common question, this common little puzzle that often people ask as kids. And that's one thing that may distinguish this chapter, or this book. The philosophy of science section, I suspect, came across as rather technical, parochial, but a lot of the questions that you ask, that we'll be asking in philosophy of mind, are the kinds of questions that you can get kids to think about, right? How many of you have had the thought, how do I know that someone else's blue isn't different from my blue? Right? It's a very common thought that it's not hard to get people worrying about. That's a kind of philosophy of mind question. The version that the chapter starts off with is the question, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there, does it make a sound? Again, very common question. The book distinguishes between the experienced sound, so when you are near disturbances in the air, you have this experience of hearing what it sounds like, this kind of inner experience. In that sense, of course, the tree does not make a sound, because no one's there to hear it. But if by sound you mean, the physical disturbance patterns in the air, then of course it does make a sound. So this leads us to have to make a distinction between two different kinds of things. Features that are features of the world that are intrinsic to the world, and features that are features of our experience. The way that philosophers have historically made this distinction is, or at least a closely related distinction that you'll need to know for the test, is the distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. This is a very important distinction in the history of philosophy. Primary qualities are qualities that belong to the object whether or not anyone is looking at them. They are, you could say, intrinsic to the object. So in the standard way of thinking about things, things like shape, weight, mass, those are primary qualities. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks about them or whether anyone's looking at them, they have those shapes, whether or not anyone's looking at them. A paradigm case of a secondary quality, I think I've talked about something related to this, is taste, how objects taste. How objects taste is not intrinsic to them, to the objects. It's a feature of what kinds of experiences the objects produce in us. So to say that ice cream has the property of tasting good, that's a secondary property. What you're really saying is the ice cream, when it touches the tongue of a human, produces the experience of, ooh, that's really good. But an animal with a different constitution may have a different response. Now, this is harder for people to accept, but in the standard way of thinking about things, color is also a secondary quality. Right? Atoms don't have color. Apples don't have redness intrinsic to them. Redness is something that is response dependent. Apples are red because of the way we perceive them. We have, now, some philosophers would contest this way of putting it, but at a first pass, when we look at a red apple, a certain pattern of wavelength bounces off of it. Now, that's primary. The fact that wavelengths bounce off an apple, that's just a feature of the apple. It tends to reflect certain kinds of wavelengths. But the fact that when I look at it, it seems red to me, that's something going on in my head. A different animal with a different set of color perception is going to have a different experience when looking at the apple. Right? So bees, when they look at an apple, will not see it the same way because their nervous systems interact with different patterns, different features of what's bouncing off. And it's not like I'm right and the bee is wrong. We're just responding differently to the apple. So colors, tastes, things like that are going to fall under secondary qualities. They are response dependent. So to say that an apple is red is just to say that it tends to create red experiences in human beings when they look at it. Yes?
Would sound be secondary as well? Because,
Good, so there's a way to distinguish it. So the primary quality of, let's say like a rock, when I hit it, it makes a certain kind of vibrations in the air. That's a primary quality. The fact that it's disposed to create certain kinds of air disturbances, that's primary. The fact that it has a particular sound to me, that when I hear it, it's, oh, that sounds like kind of like chorus or whatever, that's a secondary quality. That's the way to make the distinction. Good question. Any other questions about this distinction? Okay. Now, so let's think about these secondary qualities. So, like I said, the first pass is, well, the object has certain features intrinsic to itself, but then it produces a kind of response in me. So I just saw someone eating an apple, so there's that red apple. Naively, what you first want to say is the colors are in the apple, but then you reflect on them and think, no, bees see something different, I see something different. The redness is not in the apple. All the apple has is reflectance properties. It tends to reflect certain patterns of electromagnetic radiation. Okay, so where is the red then? And what you're inclined to say is, well, it's in my mind, it's in my brain, right? My brain has a certain reaction to the apple, and that's what gives me this red experience. Okay, but then we open the brain up and look at it. There's no redness in there. I guess there's like blood or whatever. Pretend it's a green apple. You're looking at a green apple, you open up the brain, there's no green image of an apple in there. What you see is a bunch of neurons sending signals. So you go, wait, well, so the greenness isn't in the apple, because atoms aren't colored, all it has is reflectance properties. You open up the head, nothing green in there, and now you're left with a puzzle. Where is the greenness? We're not going to answer that question now, but this is one way of getting at the problem. There's a central problem in philosophy of mind that various chapters kind of gesture at. And this particular problem is one way of gesturing at it. Where is the greenness? The bullseye of the problem, the central problem in philosophy of mind that you'll be writing about in your in-class essay is consciousness. All Right? We seem to have these inner experiences of redness, of pain, of hearing things. But then when you look inside the head, all you see are really atoms bumping around in complicated ways. How could sets of neurons, sending neurotransmitters and having sodium and potassium move through voltage gates, how could any of that give rise to consciousness? And to talk about this, to kind of gesture at the problem, we're going to watch a video from someone we've seen already, which is Russell Stannard. He's going to, again, gesture at various problems which we'll be seeing throughout this course. This is to kind of get you interested in the problem. So if we can get the lights, we'll watch this video. Okay, so that was very well put, but I want to just note that that was a mess. It was kind of all over the place, and this is a theoretical physicist, which should remind us, or should reinforce the point that this is a very difficult problem. In that video, he alludes to Descartes' view, right, when he talks about the possibility that there's a mind and the brain and they're separate things that interact with each other. That's what we'll be talking about in chapter 2 today. Given the difficulty of this problem, it is, at least for now, typically classified as a philosophical problem, even though scientists are increasingly working on it. There's different definitions of philosophy. One definition that one philosopher put forward is it's looking at how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, the lights are flickering a little. Now, if it bothers you, it builds character. One definition of philosophy is it's looking at how things, in the broadest sense of the term, hang together in the broadest sense. So we think we know things about the mind, pain, pleasure, these various mental things, and that we know about the brain. How do these relate to each other? That's a philosophical question. But increasingly, they are philosophy and psychological science are more interrelated. The book mentions the term cognitive science, which is a good term to know. So cognitive science is an interdisciplinary approach to studying the mind that takes insights and methods from psychology, but also from linguistics, neuroscience, anthropology, and philosophy. So there's a growing number of philosophers who try to make their work continuous with empirical investigations, like those in psychology, linguistics, etc. So there are programs in cognitive science. I don't think the U of A has one, but SFU, I grew up in BC, they have a program in cognitive science. And what you have to do is take a certain number of philosophy classes, also computer science. They often use like AI, computer models of how the brain works. That also gets integrated. The author of this textbook, John Heil, says he is very skeptical of this approach and thinks that philosophy should be more a priori and not so continuous with science. I am much less skeptical. I think this is a very promising way to go about things. But crucially, I think there is a role for philosophy in cognitive science, in these questions. And I'm going to show a video from Dan Dennett, who we're going to be seeing a lot of in this book. There's a whole chapter devoted to him, and as you all should know, your in-class essay will be partly based on him. And in this video, he talks about the necessity of philosophy in these kinds of areas of investigation, and his point is that what a philosopher, or what knowledge of philosophy is good at helping you do, is it's good at helping you clarify the questions. There are certain ways of framing the questions that lead to dead ends. And frankly, we're going to see some of those today. But there are other ways of framing the questions that are more fruitful. If you frame them in a certain way, you'll be able to do your investigation more effectively. So Dennett's going to speak about this briefly. So you get the lights. Okay, so that's well said. Dennett has said elsewhere that there is no such thing as philosophy-free science. Any scientific research project will have background philosophical assumptions, and a good philosopher can help interrogate and clarify those background assumptions. Now, obviously we're not going to get into this in detail today, but what he said towards the end is a good example of what we're going to see is the functionalist perspective on consciousness, where functionalism means that you should define mental states in terms of what they do, in terms of their effects either on other mental states or ultimately on behavior. So it's kind of modified behaviorism, not the strict behaviorism that people like Skinner and some other people will see, but mental states have to have some causal connection, direct or indirect, with behavior. That's Dennett's view, which we'll be seeing more of later. So here's the plan for the rest of the day. So we're about halfway through chapter 1. So the rest of chapter 1 is kind of a crash course run through all the views that we're going to see. If you have a bit of a headache at the end of that, don't worry. Each of these topics will be given chapter-length treatment, but I figure it might be nice to go through this, just so you have kind of a zoomed-out map of what's to come. And then after doing that kind of crash course run through what the intro chapter says about future chapters, we'll look at Descartes and Descartes' legacy. So in the crash course run, the first view, which you all hopefully read at least a little bit about, is Cartesian dualism, which we'll be talking a lot about today. Well, let me ask, can anyone give me a one-sentence definition of Cartesian dualism based on the readings?
World is divided into mental and non-mental states.
Perfect. So yeah, there's two kinds of things. The world is divided in two. There are mental things and physical things. And human beings have aspects of both. So we have an invisible mind or mental substance, and we have a body, including the brain. So for Descartes, the mind is not the brain. And these two things interact with each other. How? Well, that's a big problem. But somehow they causally interact with each other. This ran into pretty devastating problems. And so in chapter 3, we'll see a couple of attempts to clean dualism up and make it better, but most of those run into quite serious problems as well. The next view we'll be talking about is behaviorism. Now, the version of behaviorism that you have all been exposed to in your psychology educations is psychological behaviorism. Which is a research program. It's a research program that was developed by guys like Watson and Skinner, where you only study behavior and you study the ways in which reinforcement and other contingency or conditioning from the environment affects behavior. That's the research program of psychological behaviorism. And what guys like Skinner and Watson tend to say about the mind is either the mind doesn't exist, or if it does, we can't know anything about it. It's this weird ethereal thing. So we will only study behavior. Philosophical behaviorism, which is what this book will primarily talk about, is related. There was some mutual influence, but it's a different view. Philosophical behaviorism says, no, mental states, the mind, etc., those exist, but they are just ways of talking about behavior. The mind is not this weird entity. It's not an entity at all. It's just a way of summarizing how someone behaves or is disposed to behave. So to pick an kind of oversimplified example, to say that Bill loves Mary is just to say Bill gives Mary flowers, says certain things to her, and tends to do certain things with her. It's not saying anything over and above that. It's just a way of talking about Bill's behavior. If that sounds strange, it is definitely a counterintuitive view, but there are some big guns in that chapter. I will note, the people in that chapter who are classified as behaviorists tend not to use that word for themselves. They don't like that word, but they're usually classified that way. So one example is Wittgenstein. How many of you have heard the name? Well, I guess he came up in philosophy of science. How many of you remember Wittgenstein, either from the... he only came up briefly. So Wittgenstein is, by some accounts, the most important philosopher in the 20th century, and he is, in this book anyways, classified as a certain kind of behaviorist. The next view, which is probably the one that you would be inclined to accept if you have a psychology background, is mind-brain identity theory, where mental states are defined as states of the brain. To say that Bill loves Mary is to say there's a certain pattern of activation in his, I don't know, hypothalamus, nucleus accumbens, and some other stuff. So it's going to be hard to summarize it in one sentence, but it's some pattern of brain activity. The next view, which I already mentioned in connection with Dennett, is functionalism, where mental states are defined by what they do. They are defined in terms of their functional role. So this is similar to the mind-brain identity theory, because in humans, the functional states, well, actually, let me just make clear what I mean. So let's take pain, right? So what is pain? Well, functionalists will say pain is a node in a causal network. And it's defined in terms of causing certain beliefs. So, for example, if someone takes a baseball bat to your leg and you feel pain, you're going to believe you have been damaged in some way. You're going to represent that your body's been damaged. It's going to cause certain desires, right? Like the desire that you move away from the thing that damaged you, and so on. And then these, in turn, are connected in some way with behavior. This is kind of obviously an oversimplified version, but pain is defined in terms of what it does to these other states or to behavior. It has to have some causal connection with something else. Now, in humans, this will be a particular brain state. So they agree with the mind-brain identity theorists that for humans, this is going to be a brain state. But the functionalists, at least most of them, have said that in principle, you could have a non-biological thing that had a state that had the same effects. So if you could build a machine that had internal states that led to the same reactions and the same behavior, and all the behavioral reactions and sensitivities that humans have, not just saying, ow, I'm in pain and nothing else, but all the reactions, as long as it had all the same effects, they would say that that entity is in pain. It doesn't have to be a biological basis. As long as it has the same functional role, it's the same mental state. So this is very relevant to modern debates about AI and stuff like that. On the same day that we talk about functionalism, we will talk in more detail about Dan Dennett, who we've already seen. I forget if I've mentioned this, I think I may have. There's a professor here who knew Dennett personally. Dennett died about a month ago. And the professor here, Chris Westbury, got an honorable mention in Dennett's autobiography. So kind of a fun fact about the U of A. And the Dennett chapter is full of different ideas, but probably the most important idea, it's the name of the chapter, is the intentional stance. So Dennett thinks that there are different stances, different approaches we can take when trying to describe an object and when trying to predict its future behavior. So one is the physical stance, where you view an object as a physical thing governed by the laws of physics. And when you try to predict what it will do, you use information about its mass, its other physical properties, and predict its behavior on that basis. Taking the intentional stance means approaching an object as if it's a person with beliefs and desires. And we don't have time to go into all the details, but the upshot of taking this stance is you can make pretty damn good predictions with much less information. So for example, if there's a human and I want to predict whether there's a donut here, and I want to predict whether he will eat the donut. If I use the physical stance to predict whether he will eat the donut, I have to track every neuron in his brain and figure out exactly what it's doing, and in principle, Dennett would say, I could predict that he'll eat the donut if I had enough physical information about him. But if I adopt the intentional stance, I don't need very much information. As long as I know that he believes there's a donut there and that he wants it, I can predict that he will eat the donut. So it's a way of describing people and a way of making predictions with much less information. There's lots of other stuff in the Dennett chapter, but that's one key feature. And then we come to the bullseye of the course, which is the issue of consciousness. And here, I'm going to bring in David Chalmers, who's the other main character of the second half of the course. So if you want to get ahead, I'd recommend reading his the Reading on the Hard Problem by Chalmers. It's optional, but if you want to get extra prepared for the in-class essay, that's something that you could do. He's a very clear writer. David Chalmers distinguishes between two different sorts of problems related to consciousness. The easy problems and the hard problem. So the easy problems are problems that relate to function and behavior. So let's take a paradigm case of consciousness. So I, touch a hot stove and I feel the pain. I'm aware of the pain. So the easy problems would be explaining how I pull my hand away in response to touching the hot stove, why I go, ow, that really hurts, and why I move away from the thing, and why I form the association to not touch the hot stove in the future. All of those reactions and behaviors, all of those are classified as easy problems. Chalmers admits the word easy is a little bit misleading. He doesn't mean easy like they're easy. He really means solvable. They are solvable by the standard methods of science. And we already have, most of you know, a pretty good sketch of how this happens. There's lots of details to be filled in, but basically, signals go to my brain, to the motor, the sensory cortex, and the anterior insula, and produces certain reactions. New associations are formed. We know how to fill in more of the details. We have a kind of a sketch of how that works. So it's going to be very complicated, lots of neuroscience to be done to fill in those details, but we basically know what we're doing. The hard problem is, why is any of that reacting and behaving associated with the inner feeling of pain? So it seems like when I touch the hot stove and pull my hand away, it's not just that I'm going, ow, that hurts, and moving away, etc. There's something else, the inner feeling of pain. And the hard problem is, how could a bunch of atoms bumping around in my head give rise to that? Right? That's all it is. The brain is just a bunch of chemical reactions. And no matter how complicated, it seems very strange that chemical reactions, no matter how complicated, could give rise to this inner feeling of pain. Again, we already saw an encounter with this earlier, right? So you take this red felt. So the easy problems would be, what's going on when I look at this and can identify it as red? And yeah, there's like wavelength of light that bounces off the pen, goes into my retina, it activates the cone cells, which send signals to the thalamus and then to the occipital cortex, blah, 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 blah. And they can send signals to the motor cortex, can send signals to my mouth going, yes, that is red. So all that's easy problems. But why would any of that be associated with an inner experience of seeing red? After all, that is also just a bunch of chemical reactions. As I say, this is the bullseye. And if you are, like me, committed to a, broadly speaking, physicalist picture of the world, where there's no, magic involved, it's just scientifically describable mechanisms, this should make you a little nervous, the hard problem. This is a challenge to the physicalist or materialist picture of the world. And Chalmers, he's not committed to any particular solution, but he is sympathetic to a pretty crazy sounding view, which is panpsychism, which is the view that all matter has a little bit of consciousness. So, maybe atoms are just like a little itty bitty conscious. And when they combine and interact in various ways, you get more complicated consciousness. So the brain is the most complicated structure in the world that we know of, so it has the most complex and rich consciousness. Atoms, just a tiny bit. Now, again, that should sound crazy, but if you spend a lot of time thinking about the hard problem, you start to realize that there's no view that isn't a little bit crazy. Dennett's view on the hard problem is that our sense that there's a hard problem rests on a kind of mistake or illusion. That our introspection misleads us. There really aren't these inner magical properties of pain or redness. It's all just a matter of function and reacting and behaving. And that really, there are only easy problems. And our sense that there's a hard problem rests on a kind of illusion. So, those are the two views. So those are the views you'll be comparing in your in-class essay. Now, these two gentlemen have said other things too, so you can bring other things they've said to bear, but on the kind of central topic of the course, that's, broadly speaking, their perspectives. Or you could say they're both wrong. That's, of course, an option too. So like I said, there are readings from both of them available on eClass, as well as Keith Frankish, who's basically a Dennett defender. But we don't have time to go into all the details here because we have to move on to chapter 2. But any questions on my characterization of this central issue? Okay. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 2 on Cartesian dualism. So, as I've already said, Descartes thought that the world was divided into two kinds of things, mental things and physical things, and that these two interact. Excuse me. So, the mental thing, so the mind, is invisible. It's not a part of the material world. It has no spatial location, no mass, no physical properties. And there is a crucial, I'm going to say more about this later, but one of the motivations for distinguishing between the mind and the body relates actually to something we saw from Descartes in philosophy, the intro to philosophy at the beginning, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, probably the most famous sentence in philosophy. So Descartes argued that you can know with certainty that you're thinking. Right? So I could be in the matrix, I could be a brain in a vat, I could be wrong about all sorts of things, but according to Descartes, I can't be wrong that I'm thinking. I know, for example, speaking as Descartes, I know that right now I'm having a visual experience that appears to be a bunch of people sitting in this room. I know that for sure. You all might not really exist, I could be in the matrix, but I know that I'm having the experience of seeing people. Descartes says I can know that for sure. But that's not true of my body. I could be wrong that I have a body, right? I could just be a soul having a dream, or I could be a brain in a vat, or whatever. And that's one key difference, Descartes thinks, that you can know for sure that you have a mind, but you can't know for sure that you have a body. And as we'll see later, this is actually one argument he uses to support dualism, because if two things are the same thing, they have to share all of their properties. There can't be something that's, like one example that I'll bring up later, the morning star and the evening star are actually the same thing. Do any of you know what the morning star or / the evening star is? It's a particular planet, it's Venus. So for a long time, people had different names, so it's not a star at all, but people had this expression, the morning star and the evening star, but in fact, they're the same thing. In order for them to be the same thing, they have to share all of their properties. Once you know all the information, it's just transparent. There's nothing that's true of the morning star that's not true of the evening star. But one argument Descartes makes is, look, there is something that's true of my mind that is not true of my body. Namely, I can be sure I have a mind, but I can't be sure I have a body. Therefore, they can't be the same thing. Two quick technical terms, I believe they're in the key terms. Two key epistemological features of the mind that Descartes believed in are transparency and incorrigibility. You'll see these used a lot in philosophy of mind. Transparency means if you are in a particular mental state, you know that you're in it. For Descartes, and modern psychology post-Freud would certainly reject this, but Freud would say Descartes would say, there's no such thing as being in a mental state that you're unaware of. For him, if you're in a mental state, by definition, you are aware that you're in that mental state. And incorrigibility essentially means you can't be wrong about what mental state you're in. To be corrigible means to be correctable. So if you're corrigible about something, that means you're fallible, you could be getting it wrong, and you could be corrected. To say that mental states are incorrigible means that if I believe I'm in pain, that means I'm in pain. I can't be in pain, or I can't think I'm in pain and be wrong about that. Okay. Descartes then, or the book then, rather, has a nice classification of different properties that material things have and that mental things have. And again, these are important because, like I said earlier, if two things are to be the same thing, they have to have all of their features in common. This is called Leibniz's law. So Leibniz is a character we'll see briefly in chapter 3, very important philosopher. The law is, if A and B are the same thing, they have to share all of their properties. So what you cannot say is A equals B, but B has some features that A doesn't have. That makes no sense. So if A and B are the same, they have to share all of their properties. But prima facie, now the term prima facie, do any of you know this phrase? It's from law as well as philosophy. Prima facie means at first face or first glance. So it means you look at something and you go, well, it seems this way. You could discover upon further reflection that it's wrong, but at first glance, it looks to be a certain way. And at first glance, it seems like physical and mental things are very different. So, for example, one thing is material bodies have a spatial location, right? Any physical thing always has location. Whereas, at first glance, it doesn't seem to be the case that mental states have locations. So for example, I believe that Paris is the capital of France. That's a particular mental state I have. Where is that belief? And it seems like kind of a stupid question. Like it's not, and it doesn't have a spatial location. Now, maybe you want to say it's a particular pattern of brain activity, but certainly for Descartes, someone who's pre-neuroscience, it seems like mental states don't have locations. One that's perhaps more relevant and still seems to be right is material things are public, meaning anyone can see them. If something's physical, part of like it's a physical object, anyone can see it. So my brain, any of you could look at my brain, brain scan, or if I have a terrible accident, it could become visible. It's a publicly observable thing. But my mental states are private. Only I can see them. So my particular pain, only you can maybe guess what it's like, but only I have introspective access to my pain. So again, this seems like there's a difference between mental things and material things. So a little bit of Descartes' terminology. So his view is sometimes called substance dualism. And substance in Descartes' sense is not like a chemical substance. It's a type of thing, right? A type of, I don't want to say type of being, that sounds goofy, but, and so for him, mind and matter are two different substances, and each of them has a particular main attribute. For Descartes, an attribute is a property that makes it the kind of thing that it is. Or you could say it's an essential property. So to help, Descartes maybe wouldn't have liked this example, but if you think of like a chimpanzee, you know, chimpanzees have a certain average amount of hair, right? That's a property they have. Well, I don't know what it is, but an average number of hairs. But that's not an essential attribute. It's not like something that makes it what it is. But the number of chromosomes it has, like its DNA structure, that is what makes it what it is. If you change its DNA to be horse DNA, it would be a horse, right? So it's a defining feature. And for Descartes, the defining feature of matter is extension, being extended in space, which of course he thinks the mind is not. And the defining feature of the mind is thinking, that it's a thinking type of thing. Okay, now I want to pause and zoom in on this argument that comes out of, well, Leibniz is after Descartes, so it doesn't come out of Leibniz, but the argument that the mind and the brain cannot be the same thing, because you can be certain that you have a mind, but not certain that you have a brain. So again, Leibniz's law, which Descartes would have accepted without knowing the name, because Leibniz didn't exist yet. But the law is, if two things are to be the same thing, they have to share all of their properties. But the mind has a property that the body doesn't have, or the brain doesn't have. Namely, you can be certain that you have a mind, but you can't be certain that you have a brain or a body. So it looks like we have to be dualists. One has one feature the other doesn't have, so they have to be different. And conveniently, there is, I think, a pretty much knockdown argument against this. Not against dualism per se, but against that argument. I think that argument doesn't work. Now, I'm stealing this from my philosophy of mind professor in undergrad, although I've modified it to be about a true story. I'll just say up front, the punchline of this argument is our attitudes about X are not features of X. And so this argument will spell that out. So this is a little bit of comedic relief, perhaps. So in my family, there was a long battle between two teams, Team Pet and Team Anti-Pet. And the way the rules have worked is, if there's a tie in the number of people, we don't get a pet. So my mom was Team Pet, my dad was Team Anti-Pet. So tie, no pet. I was born, I was Team Anti-Pet, so no pet. So I have three siblings. Next was brother, Daniel, he's Team Pet, so it's a tie again. Nathan is born, he's Team Super Anti-Pet, so definitely no pet. And then Grace is born, the only girl. She's Team Pet, but she's the only daughter, so she can make my dad do whatever she wants. So she says she wants a pet, Dad converts to being Team Pet, so we get a cat. The cat wins me over, so I become Team Pet as well. But Nathan, resolute in his commitment, he still hates the cat and wishes we didn't have it, so he's the sole representative of Team Anti-Pet. And one Christmas, we thought it would be just if there was a response to this. So it was Christmas, and this is going on YouTube, so we emptied the contents of the litter box, I'll put it like that, into a gift, which we wrapped and wrote to Nathan from Luca. So, okay, so now so here's Nathan. This may seem silly, but there is a serious point from this. And then here is the box with the cat poop. So Nathan doesn't know what's inside the box. Now, he has the thought, I want what's in that box. Okay, so because usually I give good gifts, you know, we're a generous family, so he thinks, I want what's in that box. Now, what's in the box, or let's just say, I don't know, I guess I should say that which is in the box. Is identical to the cat poop, right? So surely that's true. What's in the box? Cat poop. That's what's inside the box. Now Nathan does not want cat poop. That is not a gift that he wants. But he does want what's in the box. So his attitude towards what's in the box is different from his attitude towards cat poop. We have to be dualists about the cat poop. There's like that which is in the box and the cat poop. Obviously that's silly. What this shows is that someone's beliefs or attitudes about something is not a feature of the thing. It's not a property of the thing. So the fact that we, have certain attitudes towards our mind that we don't have towards our body is kind of an interesting fact, but those attitudes or beliefs are not features of the things we have beliefs about. So this argument for dualism, I think, fails for this reason. I mention this in part because someone tripped me up with this once. I was arguing with someone with a dualist, and they got me with this conceivability argument. And there's a quote from Wittgenstein, which is, sometimes it is easier to smell a rat than to catch one. Sometimes you hear an argument, you're like, something's not right here. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something wrong with it. I think this argument is one of those cases. This is the way to show that it doesn't work. Okay. Any questions about this somewhat silly example, but hopefully the point is clear. But any questions? Okay, here's what I'll do. So the next section, I'm going to talk about free will and the problem of interaction in Descartes' philosophy, but I think maybe we'll take a break a little early. Let's take a break here. That's a whole separate topic, so come back at 12:50. All right, let's get started again. So the next section is about the problem of mind-body interaction. This is probably the problem with Cartesian dualism that is most talked about. Given how Descartes defines the mind and the body, how could it be the case that they causally interact, like he says? And one way in which I want to get you interested in this question is to talk about the issue of free will. This chapter doesn't mention it, but it's very closely related. And it will come up again when we talk about Dan Dennett's views. So, a common issue in philosophy is the issue of free will and determinism. Most of you have probably seen these terms in your intro psych textbooks, even if you repress your memory of it. So, on a certain way of thinking about these terms, they are sometimes seen as being incompatible. So, determinism is the view that everything that happens is determined by prior states. So, this often goes along with a materialist view of the world. So, if you think the world's a bunch of atoms, quarks, or whatever the ultimate building block is, well, physicists have equations that describe how those particles behave. So what happens is fixed by prior states. You give me the state at time A, I can predict what the state will be at the next time B. I think people say t equals 0 and then t equals 1, whatever, but at the next moment. There's no room for magic or for interference. Now, this is problematized by the fact that quantum physics is not, or doesn't seem to be deterministic. There are some deterministic models of quantum physics or interpretations of it, but even there, the probabilities of the next event are fixed. So this seems to not leave room for at least what certain people think of as free will, where you are genuinely free to do as you choose, and your choices are not constrained by prior states. That's one way, one common way, especially in certain religious traditions, of thinking about free will, where your choices are not constrained by prior states. It's entirely up to you. So one motivation for dualism is it more easily leaves room for that kind of free will, right? Because if our minds are not physical, then they are not constrained by the laws of physics, whether those laws are probabilistic or deterministic. The mind is outside of the causally closed universe. It can introduce a new effect. It can make a decision and then introduce something new. Again, to help you see the problem, I have another video, I think the last video I have from this guy, Russell Stannard, same guy we saw earlier, talking about the tension between free will and determinism, at least on a certain definition of free will. Okay, so that's a good discussion of the problem, where whether things are predetermined or partly random it seems to leave no room for at least a certain conception of free will, where the future is genuinely open to you. If it's determined, well, then it's determined. But if it's a matter of quantum uncertainty or randomness, that's like little coins being flipped in your head. That doesn't seem to leave room for free will either. I will just note, I'm not going to go into detail here, but one view that we will see with Dennett is compatibilism, which is today the dominant view in philosophy. My supervisor at Georgia State University worked on this. Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are compatible. The fact that things are entirely predetermined, or maybe predetermined plus a little bit of randomness, either way, we can still have free will. We just need to lighten up a bit about what we mean by free will. On this view, free will is just the ability to do what you want, to do whatever you decide to do in accordance with your beliefs and desires. And the fact that your beliefs and desires were predetermined in some sense doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for the kind of free will that's worth wanting, as Dennett says. Don't have time to go into that, but that's a very common solution. Descartes' solution, or what Cartesians are allowed to say, is no, these problems only arise if you assume the world is entirely physical. If we have immaterial minds, they can be the source of free will, because they are not governed by the laws of physics, whether those laws are probabilistic or deterministic. So, the example in the representation in the book is, solid things are like this. So, let's use a different example in the book, one that's more free will related. Someone throws a rock at me. So, there's the rock hitting my face. So that's the physical event. And then the rock hits my face, signals are sent to my brain, and for Descartes, for whatever it's worth, he thought the pineal gland was what submitted messages to the soul. The reason he thought that is the pineal gland is in the middle of the brain, and it doesn't have one on each hemisphere, like a lot of other structures do, like the amygdala, the lobes, etc. He didn't really know what the pineal gland did, but anatomically it's like, it's in the middle, it's not split into two halves. That must be where the soul interacts with the body. So the pineal gland sends messages to the soul or the mind. And then I think the book has like a bubble, like a cloud, like a thought bubble or whatever. And here we have freedom. We can decide what to do. So I feel the pain, right? So the pain is a mental thing, so that's in the mind. And then I can decide, do I throw the rock back? Or do I turn the other cheek or whatever? And let's say I decide to throw the rock back. That's my decision I make up here. Well then, the mind transmits signals to the brain, which then causes my hands to do certain things. But given that this is not governed by the laws of physics, it can therefore be free. So that seems nice, because determinism is a rather unwanted or undesirable conclusion, many people think. Okay, but the problem has centered around what the hell's going on here with these arrows? Because this thing, the mind, where I make my decision, where I feel the pain and all that mental stuff, has no spatial location, has no physical properties. How can there be a causal connection between physical things and this weird soul thing? One person who pressed Descartes on this was Elizabeth of Bohemia, and I'll show a clip of someone describing this. So, as I'm sure you all know, women were not allowed to do all the things men were allowed to do during those times, but so Elizabeth was just a princess, but she carried on a long correspondence with Descartes, which is available online if you want to read it. And the standard reading of that correspondence is that Elizabeth got the better of Descartes, and what she pressed him on was this issue. How could it be that there's a causal connection between these two things? So I'm going to show a video of Sean Carroll describing that debate. the lights. Good, so as Sean Carroll says in that video, it's this causal connection that a lot of attention has been paid to. And a related point that he brings up in the video, although he doesn't use this term, is that the standard way of thinking about the physical universe is that it is causally closed, right? Meaning there are no effects introduced from the outside. So I know some of you have a physics background, and think of things like the conservation of energy, right? Energy is not created or destroyed. So that doesn't seem to leave room for there to be new effects that are causally introduced. If you're a dualist, or at least of Descartes' variety, like an interactionist dualist, so I don't know if you use that term yet, but interactionism means you're a type of dualist where the mind and brain interact causally. There are other versions of dualism that don't commit you to that. But if you're an interactionist dualist, what that means you would predict is that when you look inside the brain, you should see, signals being sent that are breaking the laws of physics. The laws of physics would say, the sodium and potassium would do this, but all of a sudden the sodium says, F it, I'm going to do this instead. We should find that somewhere in the brain. And I think it's a pretty safe bet that such a thing will not be found, given the amount of evidence we have for things like conservation of energy. So that's what objections related to that idea say. Is that the universe seems to be, at least all the experimental evidence suggests, that it's causally closed, so there can't be these new effects introduced from the outside. A related issue that you could talk about is the issue of brain damage. I guess also related, the issue of sleep. So these are two specific cases that seem to count against interactionist dualism. So there is an extensive body of evidence that I'm sure all of you are familiar with to some degree, that mental faculties can be taken away by damaging specific parts of the brain. For pretty much any function you want to name, language, complex reasoning, memory formation, various emotional responses, including things like love, those can be messed with, or indeed taken away completely, if you damage parts of the brain. So I'm sure many of you could give examples from your psych educations, right? So Henry Molaison, hippocampus removed, can't generate new memories. There are certain brain damage cases that prevent people from reasoning effectively. If you give them gambling games or whatever, they're unable to follow the consequences of probabilities that are presented to them. There are various, you can dull people's emotions if they have damage to the amygdala, lots of examples like that. But that seems strange given that these things are supposed to be in the mind for Descartes. That's one thing you could say. And sleep, you could point to this. And specifically dreamless sleep. So when you're deep in stage 4 sleep, there are periods where there's essentially nothing going on as far as your consciousness is concerned. No dreams, no thoughts, no nothing. So you turn the activity of the brain down a moderate amount, and consciousness ceases. There's nothing going on. Very strange to say that you turn it down all the way, and then consciousness still exists. So obviously the idea of dualism is very conducive to certain religious conceptions that include an afterlife, but evidence like this seems to count against this. However, there still are dualists around. I'm going to show a video of actually a religious philosopher talking about this very issue. He presents an interesting kind of counter-argument, but also makes an important caveat that I'd like to highlight. So if we get the lights, I'll show this video. This is, some of you may have heard of him, William Lane Craig. Okay, so I show that video for two reasons. One is the caveat he makes at the beginning, which is there are religious people who are materialists, and by that he means materialists about like human beings. Obviously, God would not be a material entity. So there are religious philosophers who think that the afterlife consists of bodily resurrection. This is a view in the Christian tradition. So I'm not religious anymore, but I was raised in the Christian tradition. That's the view that I held towards the end, is that the idea of the soul doesn't really make sense, but the afterlife is bodily resurrection. So even though I'm not religious myself, I don't think I would recommend that you not prejudge these issues based on religious conviction. I think it's perfectly possible to be religious or not and take any of the views on offer in this book. The other reason I show it, though, is he gives an interesting response to the arguments that I'm making here, namely that, so the argument here is that when you damage certain parts of the brain, mental faculties are lost, and when you turn down brain activity, consciousness seems to disappear. And Craig's response is, well, they could still be separate things, the mind and the body. Think of a piano player playing the piano. If you damage the piano player can't play those notes anymore. Just like if you damage the brain, the soul can't use the brain for thought anymore. So that's an interesting response. Oh, and by the way, for whatever it's worth, Craig is not alone. Someone who shared that view, actually, surprisingly, was Karl Popper. I think many people will be surprised, but Popper was actually a dualist. It's one of his goofier views as far as I'm concerned, but anyway, leaving that aside, so that's the view, that they're separate things, and when the brain is damaged, the soul can't use it for those functions anymore. I think this is a very problematic argument, though, especially if it's connected to an afterlife, because what that means is a soul without a body in the afterlife can't do things like think, remember, feel emotions, because what this argument presupposes is that when the piano is damaged, or when the brain is damaged, those functions can't be realized anymore. The soul needs the body to do those kinds of things. So it would be a very strange afterlife if it was devoid of thought, emotion, etc. Though, as I say, there are religious people who think the afterlife consists of a new body, bodily resurrection. So I don't think that religious commitment should make you prejudge these issues. Okay, that's the end of chapter 2. Any questions about Descartes or the related issues? Okay, chapter 3 will take less time. This is, and there's some things I'm actually just not going to talk about at all. So as always, focus on the key terms. If there's something in the book that isn't related to one of those key terms, don't worry about it. But some of the issues in chapter 3 will actually come up again later. There are various problems in chapter 3 we want to avoid. So it's, I think, an important chapter to think about. So the fatal problem, at least most philosophers thought, with Cartesian dualism is this issue of causal interaction. Right? How could it be that something immaterial could affect a material thing? One solution is Leibniz's solution. So Leibniz I mentioned earlier. Leibniz, very important figure. One fun fact about him, he invented calculus around the same time Newton did, independently. This often happens in the history of ideas where the intellectual atmosphere is kind of ripe for a certain idea and two people converge on it at the same time. Another example is evolution by natural selection. Right? Darwin and Wallace arrived at it around the same time, independently. But anyways, Leibniz was also a philosopher, and he was very bothered by this issue of causal interaction. And his solution was parallelism, where the mental events, mental states, are completely causally independent of physical events. and they just occur in parallel. So the example in the book is, so again, the square box is like a physical event. So sit on a tack, and this leads to you jumping up. And this occurs through various physical mechanisms, governed by physical law. Nothing spooky going on there. You sit on the tack, signals go to your brain, signals go back to your body to make you jump up or whatever. And completely independently, at the same time you sit on the tack, there is the feeling of pain, which leads to your desire to jump up. But there's no interaction between the two realms. So it's a kind of dualism, but it's not interactionism. There's no causal relationship. This should seem a little bit goofy because then the question becomes, well, isn't it just a massive coincidence that they're just perfectly aligned? That whenever you sit on the tack, you independently feel this feeling of pain, even though there's no causal connection? And the solution, of course, for Leibniz, God. God sets it up so that they are perfectly parallel. They always occur at the right time with each other. They're always perfectly correlated, even though there's no causal relationship between them. Another view, quite radical, comes from a Frenchman whose name doesn't matter. The view is called occasionalism. And what the guy's name is Malebranche. Malebranche argues that neither material things nor mental things have any causal powers. And if you sit and reflect about it, you can get yourself, kind of crazy. When you think about it, like, so, a ball hitting another ball, what actually goes on when there's a causation? What is it that allows this to happen? And Malebranche says that there's no causal powers that material things or mental things have. The only causal agent is God. You can think of the world as like a comic book with like events. And it's not the case that there's any causal arrow between the things. God just causes these events to happen and causes them in such a way that they seem to follow this predictable pattern. But the objects themselves have no causal powers. Now you might think, wow, that's really goofy. Why would someone think that? Why are we even talking about this? The reason I bring this up is it actually influenced David Hume to put forward what is actually now one of the most popular views of causation, which is basically Malebranche's. By the way, I should say, the reason it's called occasionalism is that events in the world are just occasions for God to exert his causal power. But they have no other efficacy. They have no causal powers of their own. They're just mere occasions for God to exert his causal powers. But anyway, so Hume says, Malebranche argues very effectively against the idea that objects have causal powers. But Hume is a skeptic, so he doesn't believe in God. So just erase God, and this is Hume's view. There are no causal powers. Because remember, Hume is an empiricist. He thinks we should only believe things about the world that we have observational evidence for. And what Hume says is, you never observe causation. All you observe is event A followed by event B. And maybe you observe that 100 times, but you never observe the causation. All you observe is one event followed by another, or what he calls constant conjunction. So, no problem with mental causation or physical causation. Hume's solution is, there is no causation. At least no causation in the sense of transference or intrinsic causal powers. All there is events followed by other events in a consistent and predictable fashion. So as I say, not too much, I'm already basically halfway through the chapter. Any questions on the views I've run through? They're a little counterintuitive, but no questions? Okay. The next view, which I mentioned in passing in a chapter in the philosophy of science section, is idealism. So in Descartes' conception, there is minds, there are mental things, and there's matter, physical things. So one view is materialism, which many of the chapters are devoted to different versions of materialism. In the materialist vision, there's nothing here. Like, yeah, maybe they're minds, but they're just complicated pieces of matter, like brains or whatever. Maybe computers. The dualist view is that there's both. The idealist view is there's nothing here. There are only minds and their contents. Conscious minds and what they experience. So again, take this felt. The common sense view is that there's a material thing, the felt, that's independent of me. It exists whether or not I'm looking at it. But an idealist would say, no, you have no access to material things as they are. All you have access to is your experience of them. So I'm having like a bluish experience and a felt-shaped bluish experience. So that's all that exists, is minds and what they experience. And minds on this conception are not physical things. And as I think I mentioned, so the most famous proponent of this is George Berkeley, and Berkeley's, so there's an embarrassment for this view, which is it seems to imply that the felt doesn't exist when I'm not looking at it, because then there's no one experiencing it. And again, God comes to the rescue. Berkeley says God is always looking at everything. So there's always, things are always a mental experience in God's mind or in our minds. So therefore they continue to exist. Okay, the final view that we'll talk about is epiphenomenalism. This is, I think, the most important takeaway from this chapter, because there are views that we will see in subsequent chapters that can be taken to imply epiphenomenalism, and I'm going to say that's a problem. Any view that implies epiphenomenalism, I'm going to say that's a near fatal flaw. I've kind of said at various points that the views in this book are not put forward by idiots. They are defensible. This one is pretty tough to defend, I would say. But it's a tempting conclusion if you make certain assumptions. So here's epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism is a dualist view. It accepts that there are two kinds of things. But it also accepts the causal closure of the physical. So remember in chapter 2 that one problem with Descartes' version of dualism is that the physical world seems to be causally closed. There's not room for outside intervention. So physical events entirely determine other physical events. But some physical events, for example, brain states, produce as an epiphenomenon or side effect thoughts. So these are not physical things. They accept Descartes' arguments that these cannot be identical with physical states. But crucially, they have no causal powers over physical things. The causal arrows only go in one direction. So thought, feelings, emotions are a side effect of brain activity, like the exhaust coming out of an exhaust pipe. But they have no causal effect on the brain. Now, I just want to note, just in case you see this term elsewhere, in evolutionary biology, the term epiphenomenon or epiphenomenal has a somewhat different usage, just in case you come across it. These epiphenomenal things have no causal powers at all. They're purely side effects. But in evolutionary biology, it has a more narrow sense. So you won't be tested on this, but just as an aside, in evolution, they distinguish between adaptations and byproducts, or sometimes called epiphenomena. Too lazy. Which reminds me, one time it's always harder to spell things in front of people. One part of your brain isn't working. True story, I was lecturing on IQ in Psych 105, and I misspelled, I think, heritability whilst lecturing on intelligence. It wasn't a good look. But anyway, so what this means is an adaptation is a trait that is selected for by natural selection because it confers a reproductive advantage. So it's adaptive. It's something that's selected for because of its adaptive value, whereas an epiphenomenon is a side effect of an adaptation that has no adaptive value. So the classic example is the belly button. The umbilical cord is an adaptation, right? It's designed to get nutrients to the fetus and obviously increases your chance of getting your genes into the next generation. So that's an adaptation. But the belly button is a side effect of the adaptation. Belly buttons have no function. They're not there to gather food or attract mates. They have no function. It's just carried along for free. But epiphenomenon in the philosophy of mind sense is much stronger. It's that they have no effects at all. Not just no adaptive effects that can be selected for by evolution, but no effects at all. So at first pass, this seems like a tempting solution because you can accept Descartes' arguments that the mind and the brain can't be the same thing, but you also can accept the causal closure of the physical. But the fatal problem is that if you accept this view, then none of your behavior is caused by your mental states. So when I say things like, wow, I'm introspecting and I feel like I'm conscious, or I'm in pain, therefore I'm going to move away from the thing that caused pain, none of that is true, right? Physical states entirely determine your behavior, and your mental states are never the reason why you do anything. Including, they're not the reason why you say things like, I'm conscious, etc. And to spell this point out, I have a video, again, of Dan Dennett, talking about why this is a fatally flawed view. Okay, so that's well said by Dan. And as I say, this is a good thing to keep in mind because at various points, there will be attempting to infer something like this from some of the perspectives we'll see. And I think we should see it as, by the way, the one term I guess it's good to know, it's not testable, but it's important in philosophy, reductio ad absurdum, which means reduction to absurdity. So one way to argue against a view is to say, if we assume that that's true, it would imply this crazy thing, so we shouldn't accept that view. And a view that implies epiphenomenalism is, I think, in trouble for the reasons Dan mentioned. Okay, that is all I have to say for today. Any questions about what we've covered? Okay, yes?
I think consciousness is pretty absurd. So how is absurdism a good argument against consciousness?
No, that's a good point. So one thing you could say, I mean, I've tried to say this is, a particularly bad sword to fall on. But one thing you could say is, well, there's no view of consciousness that isn't a little bit absurd. So maybe I shouldn't be so harsh on epiphenomenalism. That's fair enough. But it has the conclusion that even the fact that you're saying consciousness seems really absurd, it's really hard to understand, your saying that can't be due to your conscious experience because it's completely separate from physical causation. But, I mean, I think this is ruled out as decisively as any philosophical view can be, but no philosophical view can be completely ruled out. And it is true that, look, a lot of the views, pretty much all the views we're going to look at have at least some counterintuitive implications. So that's fair as far as pushback goes. Follow up or?
Nope.
Any other questions? Okay, so you can stick around and ask questions if you want, and of course you can come to office hours if you'd like to see the test.